Hello, Adam Eason here, back for another episode of Piecemeal, where we take a musical phrase, pick it apart, and see what makes it tick. Today, for our Halloween week, I've got an especially tuneful moment from Modest Mussorgsky's Songs and Dances of Death. We'll be looking at the main musical phrase from his second movement, Serenade. Mussorgsky, born 1839, died 1881, was one of a group of 5 composers called either the Five or the Mighty Handful, who were more or less musical amateurs. They had various jobs outside of music as their careers. Mussorgsky himself was a mid-level bureaucrat in the St. Petersburg government, and among his aims were to create a specifically Russian kind of music, something that stood apart from the conventions of the conservatory and European classical styles. So we'll be taking a look at some of the ways he tries to do that in this phrase, and we'll start, like always, with the melody. Let's see what he's got. All right, here's our melody. Let's take a look at how it's put together. To start with, we have E flat minor, kind of a nasty key signature. He has some musical reasoning for why he's chosen this, but we'll get to that with the harmony. He's starting us off on this B flat with a descending figure, whole step descent, ba-da, and that whole step descent is repeated, ba-da. In between, there's this little ba-doop kind of thing. In a lot of the recordings that I've heard, this comes out mostly as just an E flat from the vocalist, but with a little extra kind of pitch twist in it. You don't hear like ba-da really clearly because of the tempo, and the voice makes just a smooth elision between these two notes. That then jerks right back up to the B flat, and it creates this sort of rocking, kind of herky-jerky sensation in the melody. Ba-da, ba-da, ba-da. This B flat is incredibly insistent. The B flat starts every bar for these first 4 measures. And the only thing that really changes here is the direction the melodic arc goes. Instead of going down, it leaps up, decorates this D flat with a C natural. Again, that B flat comes back and finally descends down to this F for a final cadence. The C natural right here is some kind of modal borrowing. We'll have to see with the harmony where that fits into the big picture. For now, it's just a chromatic half step, and it adds a little bit of extra color to this melody. A couple of points about how these 4 bars works. The B flat to the A, ba-da, B flat to A flat, this makes it really feel like A flat is the target note, right? This feels more like an appoggiatura kind of thing, especially after here where it's leaping up and then resolving down to the A flat is kind of the classical way that this might work. With Mussorgsky, though, we'll have to see if that holds true with the harmony. Another interesting feature of the melody, you can see the voice and the keyboard are doubled all the way up to this 4th measure right here. At this point, the keyboard still has the B flat, but adds a little extra ornament to it. When this happens, where you have 2 different instruments or voices playing slightly different variations of the same melody, that could be considered heterophony. Usually that's not a classical European thing. That shows up more often in various folk musics. But considering that Mussorgsky is looking for alternative approaches to composition that are more grounded in the Russian folk spirit, this might be an allusion towards that kind of practice. It's a little bit hard to say. It's just a very brief moment. And honestly, it's not super audible, but I think it's part of that kind of rough-hewn compositional feature that Mussorgsky tends to go for. Another interesting moment right here, the piano skips back up to the D flat while the voice skips down to the F. This line, ba-da-da-da-da-da, creates a good bit of momentum going through this cadence into the start of the next phrase. Curiously, though, the voice doesn't re-enter with the keyboard on this first measure. I kind of have to wonder, Russian's not my strong suit, but I kind of have to wonder if he just sort of ran out of syllables, but really liked his melody and didn't want to change the poem either. And so it's just kind of like, okay, that's just how it's going to work. We'll leave out a bar. But one effect of this is it makes this measure feel like a cadential extension a little bit. And then when you get the rest of the phrase, it's another 4-bar phrase. So even though these 4 bars, this creates an 8-bar phrase. With this odd measure right in here, dropping the voice, creating this unusual feeling of a phrase extension with the previous beat, it makes what's normally a very stable phrase unit in European classical music feel a little bit unbalanced. All right, so you can hear that. Let's go ahead and play through the playback and really listen, especially for this measure and how it just kind of stands out in a strange and unusual way. At this point, Mussorgsky commits to this cadential ending, gives it a little bit more of a pause, a little bit more breath before moving on to some new musical material. Here's the next bar of what might be considered the period, 8 bars plus 8 bars. Again, we're starting on that B flat, very insistent, very repetitive, but this time he creates some more melodic contour, ascending up from this B flat to this E flat, and then skipping back down to repeat that same phrase. He adds a little bit of extra decorative contour to this, but other than that, it's a pretty straight scale. Some of these rests in here, I think, are to give the singer a bit of a breath, or again, maybe to make the syllables fit the tune. But otherwise, it's the same 2 bars, 3 times? With a little cadential change on the 3rd time and extending the phrase in the keyboard alone. All right, so starting from the beginning of this section again, we end up with a periodic phrase, a 16-bar period, 2 8-bar phrases, and then skipping over to the very end, a 1-bar extension that leads into the next section of the song. Let's go ahead and hear how these measures flow together. right, so while Mussorgsky is looking for a less European style of composing, he's still grounded in a melody, harmony, bass kind of organization of pitch. So it would still be a good idea to look at the bass line and see how it fits together with the melody. At the beginning, he starts us off with a fifth between the bass and the melody, but the bass line has some additional movement to it that's not in the melody. This small skip up to a G flat harmonizing at the third. It then harmonizes down with the melody above and keeps that F even through this little musical hiccup that we looked at earlier. Again, there's a lot of repetition here, but there is some variance in the bass line. While the voice and piano stay on this B flat, he instead chooses to harmonize it with a G flat in the bass, descending down by a skip to an E flat, leading to a D flat. So overall, we have some nice contrary motion between the melody, which is ascending, and the bass, which is descending. They then move back in towards each other for this and move away from each other for this final cadence. What's kind of interesting about this half cadence, he brings us down to a B flat, which is the expected point of repose for a half cadence. But he doesn't give us the D natural that would be expected for an E flat minor scale. Instead, he keeps that D flat in the keyboard, and that gives this a little bit more of maybe a rustic quality to the sound. This puts the whole section into more of a modal feel. If you'd like to see another song that uses a mode for the basis of its melody, check out my previous video for Fauré's A Clement. Moving down to the next 4 bars of the phrase, nothing in particular changes at this point. All right, let's hear how this is put together now. I really want to emphasize this third measure here. When you're looking at just the melody and seeing B flat, B flat, B flat, B flat, another B flat, more B flats, this moment in the bass is a critical point for helping prevent the entire texture from feeling stale. So as composers, it's critical to look at, well, what elements are staying the same, what elements are changing, and if things are staying the same over a long period of time, where can we introduce new points of fresh music to keep the listener's interest? Skipping on ahead, we see again E flat in the bass, B flat in the melody. This time the bass is harmonizing in tenths. The motion in this section is predominantly parallel, and we'll have to see if there's anything that happens in the harmony to create a sense of movement that is contrary to this, or if maybe the harmony reinforces this parallel motion. All right, and then hearing this put together. A particularly striking moment is right in here where the melody goes up to an E flat, fine, nothing out of the ordinary there, but the bass instead descends to this D flat, forming a major ninth. This moment is also made even more kind of, I was about to say magical, but maybe even a little smarmy or sinister by the chord that he chooses to fill in this interval with. He chooses a D flat 9, and it stands out so strongly from everything else around it. It's a very, very ear-catching, eye-catching, ear-catching moment. Here we're starting to fill in the harmony. This isn't all of everything that Mussorgsky uses in the score, but there's enough going on. I think I wanted to leave out at least a little bit so that our eyes can focus on some important points. To start with, he has some octave doubling happening in the piano's right hand. It just follows right along with the melody up until here, where there's a big split between the B flat and the D flat. And this B flat is being held as kind of harmonic glue for these two measures. The top of the left hand, we have a musical line that alternates between harmonizing at the third and doubling at the octave. And that alternation happens again before doubling at the octave in this measure, and then once more harmonizing in, I guess these are actually tenths, I should be specific. And then buried in the middle of the left hand is this little line in here. Bum 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 bum. This line doesn't do too much on its own, but when pitted against the surrounding harmonic texture, it creates these little points of contrasting oblique motion. Oblique motion happens in a couple of different ways. One way is for two voices to move in the same direction, but producing a different interval upon arrival. Another way is what we see here, where some voices stay put and others move around them. It's also interesting because this is doubling the B flat above it. It's also interesting to look at how it forms some contrary motion between this middle voice of the left hand and the bottom voice of the right hand. They're moving against each other, creating some interesting movement within the phrase. All right, so let's hear these first 8 bars. This is one of those moments where the MIDI playback does zero justice to how fat these chords are. It's like getting punched in the face with a chocolate brick, and we haven't even really finished filling in the rest of the harmony. But for now, we move on to the second part of the period. Earlier, I asked whether these inner voices might be reinforcing or moving against the parallel motion between the bass and the melody. You can see sometimes they move with, like from this B flat to this E flat. Sometimes they move against, like this E flat to this D flat. And again, moving with the bass. Other points just form kind of a pedal almost, a pedal tone across these bars, creating again that harmonic glue that helps bind multiple measures together into the same harmonic thought. This pedal tone ends up creating some interesting harmonies. For example, right here, we end up with an A flat minor 7th. Not the most common chord in European classical music. Actually kind of jazz now that I think about it, but not everything's jazz, right? We get some harmonic inversions for interest, and then some pretty widely spaced chords. This is kind of an interesting thing to look at, that contrary motion between the top and bottom parts of the left hand, this closed voice chord moving to an open voiced chord, just kind of a little bit of a change in the texture, just very subtle, but it's there. One thing to really look out for in the end of this phrase is this G natural, alternating with A flats, Fs, and C flats. This G natural forms what we would call a Picardy third, but he's not quite committing to a full modulation to E flat major or a full resting on E flat major. The C flats keep on coming in, bringing that E flat minor feel with it. And especially this D flat 9 chord that he uses here really works against the feeling of, oh, we've arrived home at E flat. It's still a very unusual, sinister place that the text is in, and the music is being used to reinforce that. And then, right at the very end, he even just calls it quits entirely. The G natural goes away, G flat comes back, the Picardy third is gone, and he takes us to a new place from there. Let's hear how that wraps itself up, while still leaving itself open for the next musical moment. There's not too much else to add here. He's just got some extra harmonic filler to help thicken out these chords a little bit more. Sometimes it's just a pedal tone, sometimes it's helping reinforce an element of the harmony that might be otherwise missing. In this chord here, this voicing is especially strange. This chord here is especially strange in its voicing. With G flat, B flat, and D flat, we have a G flat major chord, but the only thing that gives it the sense and flavor of G flat major is that one G flat buried near the top of the texture. The bass is on this D flat, reinforcing a B flat here. I don't know. I mean, listening to it, you can hear the major quality of it, but it's just a very uncommon way of voicing this particular chord. Honestly, at the other side of the period, not much has changed. He's just got this extra reinforcement of that G flat, changing from the Picardy third back to the minor third for E flat minor. He just adds a little extra to that change to help really drive it in. All right, with that, let's listen to the whole phrase and see the end result. I guess one last thing to maybe talk about is how this setting of the text kind of fits what the text is saying. In this case, the poem is talking about a young woman who is in bed dying of an illness, and outside her window she sees this glorious knight, Knight, coming to her window to serenade her and sweep her off her feet and promise her lots of sweet nothings and romance and adventure and life. And in the end, it turns out he is death in disguise. The way these chords are set, it seems to be inferring that it's a singer accompanying himself with some kind of strummed instrument, maybe a guitar or a lute, possibly a bandura. And the whole thing has this folk music kind of quality to it that I think definitely would have fit in with Mussorgsky's larger program and idea of drawing upon Russian music and Russian styles for creating his compositions. One of the things that I've noticed in my own studies of folk music is that you'll sometimes get things which are very striking and interesting orally, and you wonder, man, how do they come up with that? And the answer is, well, they're just doing what comes naturally to the instrument and maybe approaching it with some amount of creativity and flair. I think that kind of explains a little bit of what's going on with this chord, where he's found a voicing that gets him the chord he wants, but fits the hands really well instead of trying to find some contorted way of fitting in, oh, this is absolutely a G flat major chord. He doesn't really care about making it feel like a G flat major chord necessarily. It's got all the notes there and that fits the hands, and that's all that really matters. Some of these other moments here, especially these pedal tones, definitely have the feeling of somebody using the open strings on a strummed instrument, playing some moving chords under them, and then whatever chords happen against that open string happens. So I think this moment too is another example of, hey, he's got like this folk music guitarist, folk music bandurist, and this is just how they play, right? He's not going to find a way to try and polish it up and find the perfect voicing for every single moment. It's just whatever comes out of the instrument for this particular moment is whatever comes out. That said, there's still a lot of elements to this where you can tell he's given some amount of thought to continuing the movement, continuing the momentum. Maybe that thought was intuitive more than, somebody who's very studied and learned in counterpoint, but you see those elements of counterpoint present regardless of whether this was intentional or not. So, if it was intuitive, then good ears. All right, I think that'll pretty much wrap this up for today. If you found this interesting and informative and you'd like to continue seeing videos like this, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, hit the like button to let me know you're interested. And if you have any ideas of phrases you'd like to see in the future, don't be afraid to send a comment down below and let me know. I'll try and get to it. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.